for the second.
Okay. So we're good. We're good to go, Robert. All right.
You're good to start.
We will go ahead and get started. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Thursday, March 3rd meeting of the Land Use and Natural Resources Committee. We'll go ahead and get started. And if everyone will please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Great, thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. That will be one of the nice things when we get back in person as well, is that we'll actually be in unison when we're saying the Pledge of Allegiance, as opposed to the Phil Spector Wall of Sound version of it. But anyways, Robert, can we move on to roll call, please?
Sure. And just before that, a few housekeeping items. As you may have just heard, this meeting is being recorded. For our committee members, if you're not speaking, please be sure to mute yourself. And for any member of the public wishing to make a public comment, please use the raise your hand feature or press *9 if you're participating telephonically. All right, committee members, when I call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Bulhan.
Aye.
Frost.
Here.
Gallardo.
Yes.
Gore. Absent. Harris.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
New.
Here.
West.
Here.
Vice Chair Baines.
Present.
Vice Chair Clark-Kretz.
Here.
And Chair Saragosa.
Here.
We have a quorum.
All right. Thank you, Robert. So we will move on to public communications. This is the part where any person wishing to address this committee on an item not on the agenda may do so at this time. Robert, do we have any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay, we'll go ahead and close public comments and move on to the consent calendar. Anybody have any questions on the consent calendar? All right, seeing none. Do we have any public? Oh, yes, Director New.
Sorry, I was just going to move for approval, but you get public comment.
Well, that's good. We have any public comment?
No public comment.
All right, Pierre, I'll take that as a motion.
It is. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is West. I'll second.
All right, thank you, Director West. And seeing any further comments? Seeing none, roll call, please.
All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bulhan.
Yes.
Frost.
Aye.
Gallardo.
Aye.
Gore. Absent. Harris.
Yes.
Kennedy.
Aye.
New.
Aye.
West.
Yes.
Vice Chair Baines.
We can,
Aye.
you know, if he starts stealing.
Vice Chair Clark-Kretz.
Yes.
And Chair Saragosa.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay, thank you. All right, moving right along, we'll move to our action item. We just have one on the agenda for today, and that's so item number 3, Green Means Go funding program, and Garrett has this for us this afternoon. Thank you, Garrett.
Well, thank you, Chair. Really excited to be here and really excited to have the first Green Means Go item for this committee this calendar year. It is an action item, but I'm going to maybe take it in reverse order and maybe start with the more informational aspects of it, and then we'll get to the action at the end. And of course, Green Means Go, just to give us all our reminder, SACOG's pilot program, and not pilot anymore because it has funding associated with it, but SACOG's way to encourage infill development across the region, lower VMT or vehicles miles traveled, but in a way that meets our target, our greenhouse gas target, in a way that we think it makes sense for the Sacramento region. So the full SACOG board last year and many others across the region really coalesced around Green Means Go. And that ultimately landed $34 million coming to our region in this one-time state funding. So $34 million in the 6-county region for Green Means Go. And so when I'm coming to this committee, this lunar committee throughout the year, I'll be talking about that $34 million. In other words, how are we going to spend or award that $34 million? But of course, there's other aspects of Green Means Go that will also be ongoing, and our ability to continue to communicate to the state the needs of the Sacramento region. So we are off and running on Green Means Go, the funding program side of it. Your colleague on this committee, Supervisor Gore, was gracious enough to join us on Tuesday. We had our kickoff meeting for all of your local agency staff. So we appreciate all the agency staff that were able to join us. And for those that were not, we put the recording up on our website. So we're up and running on that program. And kind of where the point we're at is we're having our draft concepts together. We want to get those in front of your staff. And then we're going to come back to this committee, and that you are the acting committee, in May, and what we call the draft set of guidelines. That's maybe a more technical term, but what we really mean by the guidelines is getting into specifics about the funding program itself. So of course, we know through your action last year at the board that these funds will be used for Green Means Go, but there's maybe the next layer that you need to act on as committee in terms of, well, what are the performance criteria? What are the weights? How much will go to different elements of the program? And that's all contained in what we call the program guidelines. So in May, you'll be seeing a set of those guidelines, and it's draft because we very much need your input on that. And then we'd come back to you in June with a recommendation that we'd hope you'd forward to the full board. And that would allow us to move forward with actually the application period in the summer and make some recommendations to you at this committee about the funding awards, some of them in sort of later 2022 and some of them in early 2023. So a lot of work going on. This is a brand new program, and it really expands our funding outside of our core sort of transportation focus to now have this be other types of infrastructure. And so a lot of work going on. And like I said, I appreciate everyone that on the local agency staff, the Seat and County staff that joined us on our webinar. We'll be having other webinars for other stakeholder groups, and we can talk about that later if there's questions. One thing we're tracking on the calendar, and this is more just to give you some information so you're aware, is, as I mentioned, this 34 million is, excuse me, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold. This 34 million is this one-time state funding. And the state is a partnership of 4 different state agencies that are really coalescing around bringing together this one-time funding. So anything that we do in Green Means Go with this 34 million needs to align with the state objectives. And so we need to wait until the state actually finalizes that criteria in their own program before we can actually move forward with our own guidelines and our own call for projects. And so we feel comfortable and confident that Green Means Go is gonna fit. In fact, it was sort of the inspiration for all this funding statewide, but it just is one risk we're tracking, in that we try to communicate in the webinar on Tuesday, this is our draft calendar, and that we can't actually move forward with the final elements of it until we get that final go ahead from the state. So just wanted to make sure that we were aware, and all the communication we're doing, wanted to give that caveat, just in that it's something we are tracking. So kind of a lot of information thrown at you, but I want to reiterate a few of the key milestones for this Lunar Committee in 2022 for Green Means Go. So again, we'll be having some pretty consistent items to you every month or so. And May is that one I spoke to earlier of the draft guidelines, June and sort of the final guidelines, and then in the fall, a recommendation for some awards, and then in 2023, a recommendation for other awards. And then somewhere in that, there's a companion program that aligns very closely to Green Means Go, but it's a statewide program where projects throughout the state, not just in Sacramento region, but in all other parts of the state will compete. And so if there's any applications coming forward from our own SACOG region, we would bring those through this committee. And so the calendar is to be determined on that, but we anticipate maybe an item for this committee's consideration in the fall as well. So like I said, every other month or so, we'll be coming forward with progress on the Green Means Go program, culminating in our recommendation of that 34 million in awards. So that's more of just the information. Again, that's kind of in the second half of the staff report. Let's pivot now and talk about the action that we're requesting this committee. Of that 34 million, we can request up to 10% of it up front or early for us as staff to stand up this new program. And so we've put together our scope and our budgeting and thinking through what we need to accomplish in that program, including direction from the state agencies of what they need to see in terms of outreach activities and technical assistance. And so we've put together a request of 1.9 million that we would ask to be able to request to the state in that sort of upfront or early work. And again, this would be to stand up the Green Means Go program, to do the early sort of administration of it, and to do all those things we needed to do around guidelines development, application development, outreach, and technical assistance to get it up and running. So we do need to have that go through this committee and then through the board. And if this committee recommends it to the full board, we'd be able to go get that upfront. So it would be 1.9 million of the 33.7 million, or we call it approximately 34 million, that we would get upfront into SACOG to stand up the Green Means Go program. And then we'd come back to the state later in this year requesting the balance of it, which would be to fund the actual projects that come forward through the program. So that is the action for you as the committee is to recommend to the full board that staff can move forward with that application to the state for the 1.9 million. So happy to answer any questions on that.
Okay, thank you, Garrett. I see Director Frost.
Thank you, Chair Saragosa. I wanted to thank James and SACOG staff for your really bringing us to where we are today with Green Means Go. It's like a bonus on top of what we already have, and it seems like nothing but good can come out of it. And I just wanted you to know that it didn't go unnoticed, the ingenuity, the creativity, creative thinking, and everything that went into it. So I wanted to thank you for that. That's pretty much it. And I'm in support of the staff's recommendation today. And if you need a motion to approve it, I can do that as well.
Thank you, Director Frost. Any other questions or comments? I had just one question, Garrett. So in that pre-application or for the stand up, is there a certain criteria or things that we needed to show to the state in that, for those funds? Like, what exactly are we going to be showing the state?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Chair. Absolutely. No, and so they laid that out, and then in the staff item itself, it's the table 1, which is maybe a couple pages in. And the leftmost column of that table is the activities that they want to see us be completing, and they're much more broader things. Like I said, program development, priority settings and indicators, outreach, including outreach to underserved and disadvantaged communities, and then engagement. And so what we did is we then tried to tie that to some more concrete tasks, right? That kind of gives some more, concrete elements to that. And then so that's sort of the second task or second column of that table. And so we will be reporting to the state our progress on that task. And again, that's something they look at to make sure that we are progressing before they decide to release the balance, the other 30+ million. So obviously we will make progress on those tasks accordingly. But so very much so that the activities have been set by the state agencies, but how we go about meeting those activities is what we put together as staff.
Great, thank you, Garrett. And James, I don't know if there's anything you want to mention here. I know this is sort of our first foray, so I didn't know if you had any comments you wanted to make as well.
Thanks, Chair Saragosa, and maybe I appreciate Director Frost your comment, and I just want to try to do as Garrett did when he opened, right back to the big picture. State has a program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? And that's part of our long range plan to get to the 19% reduction. So our job, and I appreciate you saying, Director Frost, creative problem solving, because I think that's what we have to do. We don't have any choice really in our region. We've got creative problem solving. So the way that we sort of thought about this, right, was what's the way in which we can actually reduce carbon emissions? Well, part of it is we can actually get more housing built in places where people drive less. Where do people drive less? Well, it's not just downtown Sacramento. It happens to be all over the region. And we've got really good data to show that, right? And so that approach of basically taking state goals, but translating it locally into something that works for us. I remember talking to Assemblymember Gallagher about this, the first conversation I had with him. And he said, well, James, you don't understand. We all drive up here in the city. And I talked a little bit more. And he's like, oh, wait a second. You're talking about economic development. That's what you're talking about. And I said, yeah, that's how you might think about this. We would think about, we have a housing crisis and we want to build more housing in the right places. And we need a lot of infrastructure money and revitalization dollars, which we don't have access to, right? And as great as 34 million is, to remind us all, it is not the need, but it's a great start and it's a great beginning. And I say that to try to connect those dots because in the Transportation Committee this morning, they approved a resolution that you as the full board will take up in a couple of weeks, which is essentially going to be the transportation version of these green zones, a locally owned, a locally driven, creative approach to lower emission, clean transportation, safe and active modes. And you'll hear more about that. But so just try to connect those dots, right? I appreciate the nod to this. This kind of thinking is frankly what we need to just continue to do, to try to figure out how we match what the state wants ultimately in terms of goals to what we see on the ground, right? With all of you and your jurisdictions and our partners in the private sector, which we would call maybe something different, but at the end of the day is housing that reduces carbon emissions.
Thank you, James. And yeah, I think my last comments on this too is just, I'm just excited to see this kind of moving forward. It was a lot of work to get to this point, and then there's going to be a lot of work going forward, and then hopefully, more success, more funding for our region as that moves too. And I do think there are opportunities. I know, I kind of discussed this a little bit on our pre-call about just setting up our region really in front of the line as we go forward here, which I think will really be advantageous for us as funding opportunities come through. So it's great to see. Any more comments or questions from directors? I don't see none. Robert, do we have any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay, we'll bring it back, and Sue, I'll go back to you, and if you want to make a motion.
So moved.
All right, thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you, Sean. So we have a first and a second. Seeing no further comments, we'll go to roll call, please.
All right, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your vote. Director Bullahan.
Aye.
Frost.
Aye.
Gallardo. Director Gallardo, can you please indicate your vote? Looks like she may have dropped off. Absent. Director Gore. Absent. Harris.
Yes.
Kennedy.
Aye.
New.
Aye.
West.
Aye.
Vice Chair Baines.
Aye.
Vice Chair Clark Kretz.
Yes.
And Chair Saragosa.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Garrett, for the update. We're looking forward to more of these as we go along. So appreciate it.
And Gallardo is a yes. I apologize. For some reason, I cut out there.
Thank you. I'll let the record show that Gallardo is yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to our informational items. And that's item 4. And that's the 2024 Blueprint Pathway Framework. And Binu has this presentation for us this afternoon. Thank you, Binu.
Thank you, Director. Again, my name is Binu Abraham, and I'm the project manager for the 2024 Blueprint update. Blueprint is MTPSCS. Until last month, we called it MTPSCS, and now we have rebranded it and it's calling it Blueprint. Give me 1 second so that I can share my screen. Thank you, Robert, for that thumbs up. All right, so today's item is an informational item, and it's the pathway framework. But before we go into the details of the pathway framework, I want to take a moment to review and focus on what we have done so far, where we are, and where we are going next. So last month, the board adopted the triple bottom line policy framework. The framework includes the triple bottom line goals of equity, economy, and environment. The board policy framework also included a regional growth forecast that will be used to forecast the 2035 and 2050 growth for the 2024 blueprint. In addition to this, we have also updated our engagement and outreach strategy to effectively do outreach and gather input regarding the plan. So together, these constitute a policy framework. I'm sorry. Together, they constitute a policy framework. The policy framework also has a set of high-level goals for an integrated multimodal transportation system and regional development pattern that can create a more thriving region for our residents. So this is a major milestone that we just achieved. So where are we in the process? We have completed successfully the phase 1 of the project with the adoption of the policy framework. And as you can see, it's a pink box, the first pink box that is right on time, right on target. At the bottom of the process map, you can see the year, which is 2022. The beginning of 2022 is when we were projecting to have that done. And we are right on time. And we have successfully completed phase 1. Now we are moving on to phase 2. And the phase 2 includes a pathways framework, which is shown in the hexagonal shape. So what are the next steps for phase 2? The phase 2 pathway framework involves the actual compiling of the framework and of all the pathways that we will be testing, and includes also the call for transportation projects that will go into the each of the pathways. Now let's take a look at what are these pathways. In order to understand how the land use and transportation decisions we make today will affect the future, and to identify strategies that can remain durable across a wide range of future, in spite of the changing and disruptive uncertainties around us, we are undertaking a scenario planning exercise known as pathways. I want to emphasize that this is an academic learning exercise to learn comparative difference between widely different set of futures, focused on how land use and transportation investments interact to contribute to the triple bottom line goals. As you all know, just focusing on the land use and transportation will not take into account all the other variables that affect our life, like the emerging technology, vehicle technologies, the work from home and pricing and so forth. So we will be doing a sensitivity testing on all those variables to learn how they impact the outcomes. Staff is proposing to test 3 different pathways. Each of this pathway will utilize the population, housing, and employment growth projections the CCOG board adopted in February as part of the policy framework. Each of these pathways will explore a different theme. Pathway 1, the theme of the pathway 1 is outward expansion. So this will expand on historical trends that we have been seeing recently with significant growth in developing communities. This pathway will have the least amount of infill and redevelopment, small lots, and attached housing. This is not just following the historical trend, but it is also accelerating the recent outward expansion trends. This will have the most rural residential and large lot single-family housing. The transportation focus will be on new highway capacity projects to meet the mobility needs. This pathway will have the largest number of new roads and capacity projects. Transit service will focus on geographic coverage rather than frequency of service. Bicycle and pet facilities will focus on connecting developing communities to existing network. Now to pathway 2. The pathway 2 falls somewhere in between pathway 1 and pathway 2. The theme of this is compact growth and phased expansion. This pathway is also our 2020 MTP SES land use pattern, but it will be updated to current conditions. So what does that mean? So the 2020 MTP SES, which is our adopted MTP SES, had a base year of 2016, but our current base year is 2020. So we will be adding on all the projects that have happened in the last 4 years. We'll also update the growth projections that we just adopted and reflect today's market condition. Transportation will focus on updating and maintaining transportation project list from the 2020 MTP SES and to add on project based on completed or modified projects. New transportation investments will be included where growth patterns have shifted. The focus on transit services will be to increase the service hours. Moving on to pathway 3, the third and the last theme, inward expansion. This is the exact opposite of our pathway 1, which was outward expansion. So in this one, a vast majority of the growth of future growth will occur in infill areas such as centers and corridors and established communities. This pathway is intended to explore the performance implication of a future that departs from today's land use trends. It will have the most small lot and attached housing. In transportation, capacity projects will be used to address bottlenecks and congestion. It will have a fully connected existing community through a bike and trail network. So these are the 3 pathways, but I want to mention that what I'm providing here is just the technical part of the pathway, but there are other components that are happening, like the engagement, the policy discussion, gathering the input from stakeholders, etc. I just wanted to bring your attention to what are we trying to achieve in this technical aspect for land use and transportation. So moving on to the other part of the pathway framework is the call for projects. So for the first time, SACOG staff will be asking cities, counties, Caltrans, transit agencies, and other partner agencies to use a map interface instead of a spreadsheet to provide us with project lists that will go into the pathway development. So this will be interactive and user-friendly, and hopefully it will save all our partner agencies and project sponsor staff a lot of time in addressing their key issues. So this is a screenshot of what we are trying to achieve. In the past, we have always used nomination process using tedious spreadsheet. So this is a better option, and we will hope that the sponsors will be able to see their project in an interactive map and review available data relevant to each of the goals of the blueprint. To provide more details about this approach and to orient agencies to the map interface, there will be a special regional planning partnership meeting later this month. So what is next in the process of pathway framework? Over the next couple of months, SACOG will develop and test these 3 pathways. We will use the findings of this as a learning tool for discovery. We will provide the board with an array of performance metrics and indicators that will help facilitate a discussion on what strategies and directions the board wants to prioritize on. Using this learning, we will then develop a preferred pathway in early 2023 that will become the final plan. With that, I would be happy to take any questions or comments.
Okay, thank you, Vinaya. We'll go ahead and open it up for comments or questions. Yes, Director Frost.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. I am wondering, is one of these pathways going to be the preferred pathway, or could it potentially be a mixture of what we see in these 3 different pathways? And the reason I ask that is because I think there's different jurisdictions that have different priorities, and we all support more infill, but for those of us in like Sacramento County unincorporated areas, those are areas where we have greenfield development that's been going on for decades, either waiting for decades and now planning for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And those projects are different, completely different than infill. And that's what we have in the unincorporated county. And so I guess I think, I guess I'm wondering if there can be a compromise that works for all the jurisdictions, or is it, one of these are independently going to be selected?
Thank you, Director. That's a great question. And no, none of these three pathways will be called the preferred pathway. The short answer is that these three pathways are just purely an academic learning exercise for us to understand what happens if you have outward expansion of projects, what happens if we just do infill. But real world doesn't happen that way. And this is just for us to get a sense of where it is. I do have the staff lead for land use on this call, Dov Caden, so he can give a little bit more in-depth answer to your question.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah, and I guess what I would just note, Director Frost, is that there is quite a bit of existing capacity in unincorporated Sacramento County that we certainly would be looking at growth in those areas, particularly along those the corridors, unincorporated corridors between 50 and 80, as well as North Watt and some of those areas. So we're going to see growth in virtually every single jurisdiction across all three pathways. It's really just, this is an exercise in exploring what are the performance impacts of a growth distribution that really varies by location and by type, as well as, of course, the transportation components.
Got it. Thank you.
Great question, Director Frost. That was definitely something I was going to ask, so appreciate that. James, were you, sorry, I think I cut you off there.
And I'm really just, I'm adding on, I think Banu gave you a great answer, right? Which is, we are trying to understand the choices that are in front of this region in the next few years and how they add up and aggregate to what kind of place we have in 20 to 30 years, right? And it is not as simple as, it's not really binary. It's not, 0 or 1 or, that said, I would also say, and the reason we're calling this Blueprint 2024 is that the blueprint itself, when it was locally, back to our local creative bottom-up problem solving from 20 years ago, that wasn't all infill or all greenfield either, right? That was phased expansion, that was thoughtful infrastructure in greenfield, and that was recognizing that not all infill is the same and not all greenfield is the same, right? So how, when, where we develop is critical. And the reason we did all that was because the future that was in front of us 20 years ago looked bleak. It did not look good. And as I said to the Transportation Committee this morning, the other thing so you'll have this exercise through the Blueprint Long Range Plan. We are going to try to unconstrain this a little bit for all kinds of reasons that are somewhat technical. In the last few plan cycles, we've kind of given everybody in the region who's been watching this a really narrow sort of set of choices, or it doesn't look like we're moving the needle very much. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. These pathways are really intended, as Banu said, really help us learn and to be a little bit more unconstrained and see some differentiation. So there's a long range plan, and you'll be getting updates as you have been from Banu and the team here. But I also want to mention, this is classic, good old scenario planning, right? You go back to sort of the Shell Oil scenario planning. What happens when we run out of oil? Go back to the blueprint from 20 years ago. We'll have an exercise for you at the board retreat, April the 8th, on sort of warm you up a little bit on scenario planning, right? We will have a speaker at your April board workshop from Envision Utah, which is an organization in Utah that actually predated the 2004 blueprint here in the region. For Utah, did this kind of pathway exercise, which the entire state, including the governor, kind of got behind. And then at the end of June, we're trying to actually get a board trip to Utah and Salt Lake City to get on the ground to see it. So there is no right or wrong answer with this kind of scenario planning and pathways, but it is intended to really try to better understand decisions, some of which are in your control and some of which are not, right? In the short term, what they mean in the long term, aggregated and added up, and what we can do to pull leverage, what policy choices in front of all of you in this region that today will have a real impact, if that all makes sense. So you'll have many bites at this, and I think it is the right time and the right year or period right now for this region to really, I think, given what we now know and how the sort of future has changed more recently, dig into it. So we're looking forward to this exercise.
Thank you, James, and thank you always for providing us that 30,000 foot level in bringing it all together so that we understand it. I think the only other comment I'd have was, and it was said at the front end by Benu, was, the triple bottom line and how that will be applicable to our 2024 blueprint. And as I said in our pre-meeting, the easy part, and even though it wasn't easy, but in a sense it was easy, which was getting to an REI statement, but then it will now go into practice as we move forward. And that will be part of the blueprint and part of the work that we do, which I think will be a much tougher road when it goes into practice and what that actually looks like. So it's something for all of us to continue to, I think, to think about and to understand as we move forward. So just wanted to make that comment as well. Any other comments from directors? And do we have any public comments?
No public comment.
Okay. Well, Benu, Dov, thank you so much. We'll look forward to the next update, and we'll go on to the next item.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we will move to our next information item, which is a draft of the 2023 Regional Active Transportation Program. And Ms. Cacciatore has this for us this afternoon. So thank you, Victoria.
Thank you for reminding me it was afternoon. I almost said good morning. One of those days.
I'm still having my coffee too, so I understand.
So I'm Victoria Cacciatore, transportation analyst here at SACOG, and I'm here to share information about the draft 2023 Regional Active Transportation Program Policy Framework. Presenting this for info today, and next month we'll be taking this back to first the Transportation Committee and asking for their recommendation to approve it to the full board for approval. So in other words, this is when we're asking everyone for their input on the draft. A step back on what is the Active Transportation Program. It is a funding program to increase biking and walking in California. Regional ATP is a 6-county program that we implement jointly with El Dorado County Transportation Commission and Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. So statewide, we have an increase in funding, which is great news. There's an expected approximately 35% increase in the funding. So looking at $298 million that would be distributed across the state. And then regionally across the 6-county area, we'd be looking at $15.9 million. So that's due to increases in new federal funding. And we will have an even firmer lock on the numbers later this month once Caltrans budgets finishes looking at all of the numbers. Now, of all the things that are unique and interesting about Active Transportation Program, I would say that the process of how projects compete is probably one of the most unconventional. So we'll take a quick moment to walk through that. I've been mentioning both a statewide program and a regional program, and that is because projects have the opportunity to first compete in a statewide program. So that place where they have the $298 million that they're going to distribute across the state. Projects are evaluated using a state process and criteria. They use a state application form that's developed by Caltrans in partnership with the California Transportation Commission. And then after that first step, any project that is unsuccessful in competing in a statewide funding competition then has the option to compete in our regional competition. So anybody who was unsuccessful for state funding, but then also anybody who chooses to apply directly to the 6-county regional program. But they will be evaluated using the regional process and the criteria that is outlined in the policy framework that you have in attachment A. We know that this is a lot of work for agencies. So SACOG, while working with El Dorado County Transportation Commission and Placer County Transportation Planning Agency, work to use as much information as was provided through the state application as possible. So what we have in attachment A is more or less the same application process. People have the option, they're strongly encouraged to apply to the state first, but they don't have to. It's not a requirement like it used to be due to the state guidelines changing. SACOG will work with El Dorado and Placer on developing all of the materials and reaching agreement on how the policy framework is applied in those. And then other parts that make the regional policy framework unique from the state, that we add criteria that are specific to our region, such as describing how the project contributes to a larger greenhouse gas reduction strategy. And then also how perhaps the project supports local economic prosperity efforts. So where we have three major areas of change in this policy framework. The first is that we're looking to resume an 11.47% non-ATP funding requirement. When we started our last regional ATP, we were right at the very beginning of the pandemic, and there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen with local revenue sources, and that would impact how project sponsors were able to provide local match or other leveraging funds for their project. So we made a one-time reduction to 7% with the understanding that this cycle, we would propose resuming 11.47%. Another area of change is furthering our efforts to use this funding source to advance regional planning efforts. Now, incorporating Green Means Go is something that we added in last framework. We're looking to continue that, even though we now have a more developed Green Means Go program, but we also know that Green Means Go is a one-time funding opportunity, and SACOG has access to transportation improvement funding like ATP more regularly than funding then can be used for the other infrastructure needs that help support infill. So we're looking at continuing using ATP as a way to complement the Green Means Go implementation and really concentrate efforts on how these projects can support greenhouse gas reduction efforts. A new category under the regional plan implementation arm is using regional ATP funding to support implementing the regional trail network. We're proposing a new category of 0 to 5 points for your project being identified in the implementation plan for the regional trail network. This is something that was brought up by the board back in 2020 when we were just getting started on the regional trail plan. We knew that it was a little too early in the process to tie implementation funding to the regional trail network at that time, but given that we're now on a path to wrap up everything with the regional trail action plan by this June, we think that the timing could be right for us to address that prior board comment about using the funds to advance the implementation of that planning effort. And then lastly, one other part with the regional plan implementation and how that impacts trails, we did look at how trails have been advanced with active transportation program funds in the past. And regionally, we've only invested 13% of this funding source in trails. That's compared to close to 80% that's been used for sidewalks, bike lanes, other on-road improvements. So considering that the funding source is focused on active modes improvements, it did seem like there was an opportunity for us to take a closer look on how this might help advance trail implementation in communities. And then the last area of proposed changes within the policy framework is increasing the investment minimums and investment goals for projects benefiting disadvantaged communities. So I think that one important thing to do before we launch wholeheartedly into the discussion of what it means for projects to benefit disadvantaged communities, I'm going to start with how there are multiple different definitions that are identified both through the state using statewide tools, such as median household income, Cal and Biro screen, free or reduced price meal programs, the Healthy Places Index, and whether an area is a tribal land or not. And that's in addition to our region-specific metrics that are connected to our long-range plan. You can see a map of that in attachment B. And here's a snapshot at how we've invested our past regional active transportation program funds. So across all of the rounds that we have held since 2014, about 2/3 of the total funding has gone towards projects that are benefiting disadvantaged community residents. This is well in excess of the regional or the state ATP funding requirement that at least 25% of the projects provide a benefit to disadvantaged community residents. There are 25% of the funding. That's also in excess of our proposal. That's in line with the federal initiative for Justice 40, that 40% of the available funding go toward projects that benefit disadvantaged communities. And then lastly, we have an aspirational goal that we would use as kind of the framing when we're talking with project sponsors and with other people discussing how we hope that regional ATP funds would be spent of 60%. And so the way that this plays out differently is that right now, if you read through the policy framework and the evaluation process, we use the 0 to 10 points for determining whether a project has a benefit to a disadvantaged community as more of a reporting metric, but it's not factored into the total project score that's used for ranking. If we have a funding recommendation that does not meet that state requirement of 25%, what we do is we add in that 0 to 10 points and then we re-rank the whole list. With a regionally identified minimum investment of 40%, we would raise that threshold from 25% to 40%. So you can see that the 40% is a more meaningful floor for our region based on our past performance, in addition to being in line with those federal initiatives. And 60%, while we have exceeded it in some of the past years, we haven't made it all the time. So it is something more of a goal for us to reach for. So that wraps up, I'd say, the bulk of the discussion on that. I do want to take one quick jog forward in my PowerPoint to note that I've mentioned the statewide program. They have a large milestone coming up. They will be announcing the call for projects on March 16th. Applications to the state ATP will be due June 15th. And then lastly, this is the main point of input for the Land Use Natural Resources Committee, since we will be taking input from all of the SACOG committees and then folding that into a final policy framework to present to the Transportation Committee in April and asking for board approval on April 21st. So that concludes my presentation, and now go to your input and questions.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. Any questions from directors? Victoria, I have a question on, so the date that the CTC takes or puts a call out, when do they actually go into the awarding? When's the awards?
Draft awards will be announced mid to late October. I can't remember the exact calendar date, but you'll know before the end of the year, and the awards will be adopted at their December meeting.
Gotcha. And I know we had a project in Placerville, it was Upper Broadway, and it was really a good, I thought, example of how you can leverage funds, because we were able to do ATP funds, do our road at the same time, put in bike and pedestrian lanes, as well as redo our pipes and redo our street on Upper Broadway in Placerville. There was just a nice way of economies of scale as we move forward with some of our funds, with our Measure L fund, which is our local sales tax measure that we have put forward as our our match in there. So definitely always good when you can have those economies of scales for projects and stretch those dollars even further. But any questions, comments? Everyone needs coffee. No, Victoria, you really did a great job of I think showing us how this is going to lay out as we go forward here. I have a question on going to the 60%. I love stretch goals. I think stretch goals are needed so that you don't get complacent in what you're doing. My only question is, are we stretching ourselves too far with 60%, or do we feel very comfortable in that being a number that will be meaningful as well as impactful with the CTC as they look at our proposals as a region?
I don't think that we're stretching ourselves too far with that. I do think that it's a meaningful goal for us, the same way that raising above the state requirements for the floor is meaningful. Nothing is ever a given, and projects take a lot of time to develop. I know that it can take over a decade for a project to go from concept to shovel in the ground. But I think that it would be a good thing for us to strive for. I know that, or I'm not sure if James has more to add.
Thank you, James. Any comments there?
I don't think it's too much. We had actually batted around a stretch goal of 70. I mean, I think your stretch goal should be, in general, not necessarily things that you normally hit, right? And so you just remember that chart from what Victoria said. I agree with you, Chair Saragosa. It's good to have stretch goals. It's good to set them high, not that they're unachievable. And as you know, we've been working very closely with our partner agencies in your county and Placer on this one. So I think 60 is very reasonable. I think we could have gone higher, but I think that's where we landed.
Okay. Sounds good. And I like the trail segment of that as well. I mean, it just goes back to everything that we're trying to do and that interconnectedness. So that was a good add in there as well. Okay, seeing no further comments, let's go ahead and move to public comments if we have any.
No public comment.
All right, close public comment, bring it back. I know this is a file and receive. So we'll go ahead. All right. Well, Victoria, thank you for the update, and we'll see how this moves along here. Thank you. Okay. We're going through today's meeting quickly. We'll go ahead and move to reports. And these are committee member reports for anyone that wants to have a report out for their respective agency, city, county. Yes, Director Frost.
I have a question. We had this conversation in LAVCO the other night, and it's on my mind. I know there's conversations at the state on how they're going to handle the Brown Act and remote meetings. And I know in some meetings it's important for us to be there because we tend to get public at those meetings. They want us to be there where they can stand before us and make their public comments. But in a lot of our committee meetings, we don't really have a lot of public comment, and it doesn't seem as much of an issue. And so James, I wasn't sure where we were at on this, how we would be moving forward. Will we be in person? Will we be doing, sort of a, you can be there in person or on Zoom?
Yeah.
I'm curious to know what your thoughts are and what everyone's
Yep.
thoughts are.
Thank you, Director Frost. Yeah, no, this is obviously, I know, an issue of great interest to the board. You will be in person. I'm hoping to see you all Friday, April 8th at the retreat. So we've got a great space for that. We are talking about what the most recent changes might mean in terms of our April meetings. And I know Director Kennedy's got his hand up here. Also, just in terms of what actually is possible now that the state is really relaxing things. So Eric or Kirk, do you want to? So there's nothing definite. So here's the quick answer is there's no definitive decision yet. It's a good time for you to bring this up. We have installed technology in the SACOG boardroom to now allow technologically more hybrid meetings, right? Two-way communication, some people being able to be in person and others on the screen. We didn't really have that before the pandemic. So that has been installed. But in terms of what we are sort of able to do or how we interpret some of the state guidance, Eric or Kirk, you want to jump in?
So I'll defer to Kirk on how we're interpreting the law, but I think just in terms of the experience, you mentioned the public commenting, and I think one of the things that we're planning to do going forward is to allow for remote participation. So to really allow people to have the opportunity to observe the meetings. We are going to reach out to all of you. Lynette, our clerk, is going to be doing this. And so we can't guarantee right now exactly if we can accommodate teleconferencing for every board member, but we would like to explore to see what is available if we are not able to use the authorities under AB 361 any longer. So there's some discussion that we'll be having with you in the next several weeks about that if we are no longer able to use these provisions. Kirk, do you want to add?
I guess, yeah, thanks, Eric. I guess, Director Frost, what I would add to that is it's certainly a dynamic and changing situation. We felt comfortable advising the staff that it was okay to proceed under AB 361 and making the resolution findings for the month of March. It is well likely that by the time we get into April, the guidance will have changed at the local and state level enough that we will be required actually to go back to in-person meetings or compliance with the old standards unless there is some other legislative or regulatory change in the current environment. So I would expect you're going to be moving back towards the old system without these types of remote meetings probably sometime in April.
Oh, thank you. It's funny. There are benefits to the hybrid. Some people who can't drive downtown can actually participate, and it reduces driving. So, I mean, it's more convenient. There are benefits to it, and I know it's a sensitive issue with some of our constituents who really want to be there in person, but not on all the board meetings and committees. So I'm hoping we can work through it, and thanks for your input.
Thank you, Sue. Vice Chair Kennedy.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to, I understand there's a bill before working its way through the legislature that would essentially do what Kirk said, and that April would be the last time that we could, if it goes through, that April would be the last time that we could meet virtually. That being said, to James, I beat this drum all the time, particularly at AQMD, but I think SACOG and AQMD, being that vehicle miles traveled is what we're all about. I agree with Director Frost, and I would, suggest we come to the board with and working with Christina to look to find legislation that could allow for exactly what Director Frost is talking about.
It certainly is a convenient. I mean, I think especially for someone the outlier. I mean, whether it's me in Placerville or Yuba City or somewhere else where although I do miss everybody and want to see you in person. There may be times when it's certainly a matter of convenience, or I know, like I had my Pioneer Community Energy meeting at the same day as a SACOG meeting, and so trying to get from Sacramento to Auburn and from Placerville, I'm doing a big triangle, and so it certainly would be helpful, and it does go back to VMT and just getting cars off the road as well. So it's certainly something I think for us to consider, or at least look at.
Chair Saragosi, the other interesting thing about this, and it's not that we couldn't do it hybrid, but as we think about speakers and bringing people in to talk with the board, if we've been doing the workshops, we probably couldn't get half of those speakers if we were trying to fly them in here. It certainly would be a lot costlier. And yes, you can do that on a screen, right? But if those of you who have been all in the boardroom before the pandemic, remember we had a couple speakers on a screen, and it's just not the same in some ways. It's great to have them in person, but actually Zoom does facilitate this ability in some ways to tap even just our last two speakers, right? The head of the California Transportation Commission, USDOT, they would not have been here in person. So just we'll weigh all these things, and definitely hear you, Director Kennedy, Vice Chair Kennedy, on the what can we do to support a little bit more flexibility. We would like to have that flexibility, as you say, that we don't have to notice public locations so much, but we could do something that's both accessible to the public, but that allows you to zoom in and wherever it's most convenient. So that's, I think we see the same goal you do on that one.
Okay. Any other comments from directors? Okay, James or staff, anything else you want to touch on?
I don't think from our end, well, let's see, maybe I'll revise that. Two quick things. One is, I know we've been talking, and I've been talking to many of you about cap to cap pre-trip. Speaking of land use and all of these things, and Green Means Go, we've got a great Northern Virginia tour scheduled. There's a few spots left on that. If you are going to cap, or even you think you might be able to get there, let us know. We're doing a similar trip, as I mentioned earlier, to Salt Lake City at the end of June. And then just going forward, just a reminder, I think and this is whatever the committee wants, whatever you want to do with the committee reports on the agenda. When we were going through housing element updates and the REAP funding, this really was about, hey, here's what's happening in our jurisdiction on housing elements, on housing approval. So it's your time to spend, and I think the remote meeting question was a very timely one. But as you go forward, think a little bit about, in particular, there are so many challenges, right? And so much interest. You remember Chair Gore's challenge from late last year. We wrote that up and sent it back out to all of you. It was a wonderful thing to see how each of you is trying to tackle, in some ways, the housing and affordable housing challenge. So I just put that back on the table for you. Think a little bit about how you might want to use those updates in these committee meetings. That's all from me.
All right, thank you, James. All right, seeing no other comments, we do have a receive and file. So if you haven't already looked over the report on the blueprint implementation, please do so. And with that, then at 2:39, I will go ahead and adjourn today's meeting. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, James, staff, and to my fellow directors.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.